Thank you, Richard Gage. Our next speaker, Mick Harrison, is the litigation director of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 inquiry. And when I mentioned that we just submitted a new grand jury petition, well, Mick is very instrumental in putting that together. He is a public interest lawyer for 27 years, experiencing litigating whistleblowing protection, environmental enforcement, constitutional rights, Native American rights, federal false claims rights. And if you're talking about people's freedom, Mick's the guy. We're honored that he's with the Lawyers Committee and our litigation director. I want to present Mick Harrison from Indiana.
Good afternoon, folks. David asked me to give you the short version of what legal actions we have in progress to build on this evidence you've been hearing about. So is this any better? Okay, maybe my technical colleagues can help with the volume. So as a former teacher, I don't normally have this problem of projecting. So the short version is the Lawyers Committee has 5 active federal lawsuits at this time, building on the evidence we're talking about. 3 of them are Freedom of Information Act lawsuits to help obtain records still in the hands of the federal government that the public has not seen yet. One of those lawsuits is against the FBI, and I'll give you the details on that. And the other is the lawsuit that David just mentioned, which is the mandamus lawsuit to force the U.S. attorney to provide all of this demolition evidence to a special grand jury. And so these lawsuits are progressing. They're in different stages. The FBI lawsuit is regarding a commission that some of you may not know about. It's not the original 9/11 commission. It's regarding a later 9/11 review commission. And for those who don't know, that commission was mandated by Congress in 2013. It did its work in 2014 and 2015, issued a report in March 2015, and the Congress had ordered the FBI to do this new evaluation of all 9/11 evidence that had not been addressed by the original 9/11 commission. And there was a lot of 9/11 evidence that was not addressed by the original 9/11 commission. And all of the demolition evidence you've heard about today is among that evidence that was not addressed by the original 9/11 commission. So how much of the demolition evidence did the new 9/11 review commission address? And the answer is 0. They didn't look at any of it. They didn't even acknowledge that that body of evidence was out there. And there are a number of other categories of evidence that was not looked at by either commission. So the purpose of this lawsuit, currently in the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C., is to get a court order directing the FBI to go back and do what Congress ordered them to do, which is to assess and report to Congress, and thereby to all of us, all of the 9/11 evidence not addressed by the original 9/11 commission. And other categories briefly of that evidence, in addition to the controlled demolition evidence, there was a body of evidence regarding some individuals arrested on 9/11 under suspicious circumstances. The FBI calls them the high fivers. That evidence was not addressed by the new commission. The evidence of Saudi and other international financing for some of the alleged hijackers, not addressed by either commission. The evidence of the Pentagon videos, which we have yet to see, from the Pentagon and the surrounding areas, not addressed by either commission. The evidence of plane wreckage and parts recovered from the scenes of the 3 crashes, and most of you have seen the pictures of the FBI walking in lines across these crash areas, picking up evidence, every scrap of evidence they could find. That evidence has yet to be evaluated by either commission or reported to Congress or the public. And the other category we've addressed at the moment has to do with phone calls reportedly made from the planes on 9/11. And there's an issue, some of you may know about that. The FBI gave one description of those calls to the 9/11 Commission and another description of those calls to a federal court in the Moussaoui case. So that lawsuit is progressing, and we'll let you know how that goes. We have an inkling of what the government's response is going to be. They filed initially a motion to dismiss, arguing legal technicalities, that we didn't have standing to even raise the issue, and that the congressional mandate wasn't really enforceable. We filed an amended complaint after that, which mooted their initial motion, so we'll be seeing that motion again shortly. The Freedom of Information Act cases we have pending, one is against NIST and FEMA for all the building performance study data, and we actually acquired a lot of their records already because of that lawsuit, but there's more they're withholding. That case, the status of that case is we filed summary judgment motion, so it's the government. We're expecting a decision any moment on that case, and we'll let you know what happens on that. The government has basically taken the position that, notwithstanding records that we have that refer to these other records they have never provided, that they can't find the records that their own reports refer to. So we'll see how that works out. The second FOIA case is against NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. We're trying to get the interviews that NIST investigators did with first responders, and those have yet to see the light of day. We hope they will soon because of our lawsuit. And the third Freedom of Information Act lawsuit is regarding column 79. You saw that mentioned by Richard. Column 79 is where NIST says the collapse of Building 7 started. And we're trying to get all the data regarding column 79, which we think will support the findings of the study just released by Professor Halsey from Alaska. So that is a significant lawsuit as well. The last lawsuit I'll talk about today is our mandamus lawsuit. Mandamus basically has to do with enforcing a mandatory duty. You may not realize all of us as citizens have a right to sue a public official who fails to perform a mandatory duty. And the duty in this case is the U.S. attorneys, imposed by a federal statute, as David mentioned, to hand any evidence from any of us of a federal crime reported to a U.S. attorney over to a special grand jury. The U.S. attorney has no discretion about this. It is a mandatory duty, must do. So we did get an encouraging sign, as David mentioned, from the U.S. attorney in the Southern District here in a letter saying they would comply with this statute. But they gave no details about what steps they would take to comply. And so we still don't know whether our petition and all of its evidence of controlled demolition has been given to a special grand jury. It may have been given to a special grand jury, and we're hoping for the best on that. But because the U.S. attorney, and as David mentioned, we called the assistant U.S. attorney, Michael Ferrara, who has the terrorism unit in the Southern District for the U.S. attorney, and his position was because of Federal Rule 6, Criminal Rule 6, he couldn't disclose any details to us. And so we're stuck having no way of knowing the status. And not being inclined to be stuck, we brought this federal lawsuit asking for two things. First, we're asking for a disclosure of certain records and information so that we can know that our petition evidence was actually handed to the special grand jury. If it was, that lawsuit will be over. We'll have accomplished that goal of getting all this evidence you're hearing about in front of 16 to 23 regular citizens to decide how to investigate it. And we hope that that is happening as we speak. However, if we don't get that disclosure ordered, or if we get a disclosure and the disclosure is the U.S. attorney has not actually given our evidence to the grand jury, then we're asking for a court order that the U.S. attorney be directed to give that evidence to a special grand jury. And so that lawsuit was filed yesterday, and we had the good help of a New York attorney, John O'Kelly, who may be here in the audience. And I thank him for having the courage and integrity that not all members of my profession have had on this issue, and we couldn't have done this without him. So thank you, John. Now, let me close to say that the evidence we presented of controlled demolition in these litigations is not just persuasive, it is, in our view as lawyers, dispositive, which means that the doubt has been removed about it. And a number of the categories of evidence standing alone are scientifically dispositive. And what that means is that they've eliminated all other potential explanations other than the use of explosives. And as Arthur Conan Doyle has said through his character, Sherlock Holmes, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And that's where we're at on the controlled demolition issue. And we hope the courts at some point will come to grips with that. Now, a lot of my colleagues aren't here, they're in various parts of the country and the world at the moment. And, but we have a number of strong motivations for continuing our work. And I want to share one of them with you because it's related to the historic actions we've heard about from Commissioner Joya and his colleagues. And that is, if you watch the video record of what happened on 9/11, you'll observe that one of the firefighters made his way up pretty high up in one of the towers. And he reported back that the fires were, you know, there weren't that many fires, they weren't that bad. A couple lines, a couple hoses could knock them down. And shortly thereafter, and I do mean shortly thereafter, that building collapsed. And now that we know from this evidence that there were explosives placed in the buildings, that means that whoever triggered those explosives at a time that they knew that these courageous, selfless firefighters and first responders were in that building and that they were going to be killed when they triggered those explosives. And they did that knowingly. And, you know, you have to sort of let that sink in. And so that is one of the motivations for me and why we're not going to stop until we do get transparency and accountability on 9/11. Thank you very much.